Terrence Boykins built his entire adult identity around being the man who never says no, to family, to friends, to strangers with a broken furnace at midnight. This video follows one Black Gen X man's slow, unglamorous realization that his lifelong overgiving wasn't pure generosity, but a survival strategy rooted in a childhood lesson about what happens to men who stop being useful. It traces how that lesson protected him for decades, what it quietly cost his health and marriage, and what finally changed when his own body forced the question he'd spent 30 years avoiding. At 2:14 in the morning, Terrence Boykins' phone lights up on the nightstand, and his wife doesn't even open her eyes. "Is that your sister, or is that work?" Renee asks, already nudging him before the second buzz. For 31 years, Terry has kept one ringtone reserved strictly for family emergencies, a short two-note chime he assigned back when his mother was in and out of the hospital, and every call really was one. Tonight it's his nephew Marcus, whose car won't start in a major parking lot 40 minutes away at an hour when most 55-year-old men would let it ring. Terry doesn't let it ring. He's already sliding his feet into the shoes he keeps by the bed for exactly this, because somewhere along the way, emergency stopped meaning crisis and started meaning anything Terry might say yes to. That's the part almost nobody around him has noticed, including, for a long time, Terry himself. Terrence Boykins runs Boykins Heating and Air out of a converted garage on Cleveland's southeast side, 3 blocks from the house he grew up in. Customers call him the guy who shows up, and they mean it as the highest compliment they know how to give. What they don't see is the shoebox in his back office, rubber-banded stacks of invoices for jobs he never charged for, going back further than he can accurately remember. He tells himself it's generosity. Some of it is. But generosity doesn't usually come with the specific exhaustion Terry carries by Thursday afternoon, the kind that sits behind his eyes instead of in his back or his knees. This is a story about a particular kind of Black Gen X man, one raised to believe his worth was measured by how much he could carry, who spent 3 decades proving it, and who is only now, quietly and without any ceremony, starting to put some of it down. Here's the contradiction sitting underneath almost every decision Terry makes. He is, by any honest measure, one of the most generous men in his family and one of the loneliest. People assume those two things cancel each other out, that if you give enough, you eventually feel full. Terry could have told them, if anyone had asked directly, that it works the opposite way. The more indispensable he became, the more invisible he felt, because nobody was checking on the man doing the checking. To understand why Terry answers a 2 a.m. text about a dead car battery, you have to go back to 1984, to a rolling mill on the industrial flats along the Cuyahoga River. Terry was 13. His father, Otis Boykins, had worked that mill floor for 16 years, the kind of job that let a black man in Cleveland buy a house, keep a wife in the church choir, and put good shoes on 3 kids every September. Then the line slowed, then it stopped, then Otis came home one Friday with a check instead of a schedule. Cleveland lost a huge share of its manufacturing jobs through the 1980s, part of a wave that hit industrial black communities across the Midwest especially hard. A pattern the sociologist William Julius Wilson spent years documenting in cities like it. Wilson's research showed something specific. When steady manufacturing work disappeared from a neighborhood, it didn't just remove income, it removed the structure that organized a man's week, his identity, his sense of being needed by something. Otis didn't disappear right away. He tried 3 other jobs in 2 years, each one paying less and respecting him less than the last. By the time Terry was 15, his father had mostly stopped trying and mostly stopped talking, spending long stretches in the garage with a radio and a car he never actually finished fixing. Terry watched his father go from a man everyone in the neighborhood called on to a man nobody called at all. That distinction planted itself somewhere in 13-year-old Terry and never fully left. Being needed was safety, and being unneeded was something closer to disappearing while still alive. Terry's story is personal, but the shape of it isn't unique to him, and it isn't only about Cleveland or steel. Demographers who study Generation X, roughly those born between 1965 and 1980, often point out that many of these kids came up during a stretch when both single-parent households and dual-income households were rising fast, and organized after-school supervision hadn't caught up yet. That produced a large, quietly self-reliant generation of kids who let themselves in after school, made their own dinner, and learned early that asking for help wasn't always an option, because there often wasn't anyone available to ask. Add the particular economic terrain many Black Gen X families were navigating, industrial decline in cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and Gary, and you get a specific psychological mix: capable, independent, quietly overloaded kids who grew into capable, independent, quietly overloaded adults. Terry didn't invent hyper-reliability. He inherited a version of it that was already common in his generation, then sharpened it further inside his own household. With his father retreating and his mother, Gloria, picking up a second shift as a nurse's aide to cover the gap, Terry became the oldest son doing an oldest son's unofficial job. He walked his sister Denise home from school. He learned to stretch $5 of gas money into a full week of his mother's shifts. He figured out which neighbors would loan a cup of sugar and which ones you didn't ask twice. Family therapists have a specific word for a kid who takes on adult-level responsibility before he's emotionally ready for it: parentification. It isn't automatically damaging, and researchers are clear it often produces genuinely capable, resourceful adults. But it teaches a lesson that's hard to unlearn later. Your value in this family is tied to what you provide, not simply to who you are. By 17, Terry had absorbed that lesson so completely he couldn't have named it as a belief, only as a fact about how the world worked. Fast forward to Terry at 55, and that same wiring is running his whole life, just wearing a work uniform instead of a school backpack. At the shop, he's the technician who takes the Sunday emergency calls his 2 employees have learned to route straight to voicemail. He's the one who forgets to invoice elderly customers on fixed incomes, then remembers to feel proud of himself for forgetting. Take the tuition conversation with his sister Denise, 3 years back, because the details matter. Denise called on a Wednesday night, voice tight, explaining that her son Marcus was $1,200 short for spring registration, and the deadline was Friday. She wasn't asking directly. She was just talking out loud the way people do when they're hoping somebody offers before they have to ask. Terry didn't make her ask. He said, "I got it," before she finished the sentence, then transferred the money that same night without checking his own business account first. It turned out fine financially that particular month. But Renee found out about it from Denise, 3 weeks later at a cookout, in front of Terry's own mother. The look Renee gave him across the picnic table wasn't anger exactly. It was something closer to fatigue, the specific fatigue of a wife who loves a generous man and is tired of being the last to know how generous he's being. When Reggie Combs, who owns the auto shop 2 doors down, blew a transmission in his tow truck last spring, Terry co-signed the repair loan without reading much past the payment amount. Ask Terry why he does any of this, and he'll give you a version of the same answer every time. That's just what you do for people. What he won't say, because he genuinely hasn't examined it, is that people rarely includes himself. You can learn most of what you need to know about a man like Terry from a few small, specific habits. He folds cash the same way his father used to, in half and then in half again, so it sits flat in a money clip instead of a wallet that makes a man's back go crooked. At restaurants, he always takes the seat facing the door, not out of paranoia exactly, more out of the old habit of a man who likes to see trouble coming before it sees him. In his garage, next to a lawn mower he's rebuilt twice, there's a coffee can of mismatched screws he refuses to throw away, because somewhere in his head, a screw thrown out today is a problem created for tomorrow. When his phone buzzes with bad news, his face doesn't change much. He just gets quieter and starts moving, which people who don't know him well mistake for calm, and people who do know him recognize as something closer to bracing. He answers texts within minutes, always. A response speed his daughter Aisha jokes is faster than men half his age who supposedly grew up on their phones. What Aisha doesn't say, because she hasn't quite put it into words yet, is that the speed isn't about the phone. It's about a boy who once watched his father's phone stop ringing and grew into a man who made sure his own never would. Terry is also, against his own will, the unofficial IT department for a 22-person family group chat, the man who gets a 6 a.m. text asking why somebody's printer won't connect to a Wi-Fi network 4 states away. He has never once said, "That's not my job." He has, more than once, walked a cousin through router settings over speakerphone while eating breakfast standing at the counter, which Renee finds both endearing and, by now, a little exhausting to watch. On Saturday mornings, Terry gets his hair cut at a shop on Kinsman, where 3 chairs have been running since before he had gray in his beard. The conversation there moves the way it does in barbershops in black neighborhoods everywhere, fast, loud, funny, and occasionally dead serious without warning. One Saturday, Reggie brings up the transmission loan, half joking, calling Terry the family bank that never charges interest. The room laughs. Terry laughs too, the specific laugh he uses when something true gets said out loud and he'd rather not sit with it. An older barber, a man in his 70s who's cut 3 generations of Terry's family, doesn't laugh. He just says, without looking up from the clippers, "Boy, you gone run yourself into the ground taking care of grown men." Nobody in the shop treats it as an insult, and nobody treats it as news either, which is its own kind of answer. There's a name for what's happening to Terry physically, and it comes out of research most people never hear about outside a doctor's office. In 1983, the epidemiologist Sherman James coined the term John Henryism, named after the folk hero who beat a mechanical drill in a steel driving contest and then died from the effort. James found that men, disproportionately black men working with fewer economic resources, who cope with hardship through relentless, high-effort determination, show measurably higher rates of hypertension over time. The strategy works, in the sense that it gets the job done and earns real respect. It also runs a body hard for decades, and bodies keep a ledger whether or not anyone's reading it. Researcher Wisdom Powell has spent much of her career studying a related pattern she calls restrictive emotionality, the tendency of men raised inside rigid masculinity norms to keep their stress locked behind a calm exterior. In her studies of African American men, several conducted right in barbershops much like the one on Kinsman, she's found that this restraint correlates with higher depression and a documented reluctance to seek medical or mental health care until a crisis forces the issue. Terry has never been to a therapist. He has, on 3 separate occasions in the last 2 years, told Renee he was just tired, when what he meant was something closer to grief he didn't have a name for. There's a wider economic backdrop that makes Terry's specific role in his family make even more sense. Federal Reserve data on household wealth has long shown a wide, persistent gap between black and white American families, one that means even solidly middle-class black households, like the Boykinses, often carry more responsibility for extended relatives, without a financial cushion of their own. Researchers sometimes describe this informally as a kind of family tax, a real and recurring drain on savings that peers with similar incomes but more generational wealth are statistically less likely to carry at the same scale. Terry has never seen that phrase in a research paper. He's felt it every month in a line of his own budget he privately calls everybody else. There's also a generational squeeze specific to Terry's age bracket that researchers have given its own label. Pew Research Center has written for years about what it calls the sandwich generation. Adults simultaneously supporting aging parents and grown or nearly grown children, often while trying to build their own financial security at the same time. Terry sits right in the middle of that sandwich, driving his mother Gloria to dialysis appointments twice a week while still covering gaps for Denise, and less directly, for Marcus. Being part of the sandwich generation and being the family's designated fixer aren't the same thing, but in a man already wired toward hyper-reliability, they reinforce each other in a way that makes stepping back feel almost structurally impossible. There's simply always another appointment, another gap, another 2 a.m. text. Back in the 1970s, the anthropologist Carol Stack spent years embedded in a Midwestern black community for her landmark study, All Our Kin. documenting what she called an exchange network, a web of obligation where families without much individual wealth built collective security by constantly circulating money, food, and favors. Stack's research reframed a pattern outsiders had mistaken for financial recklessness, showing it was actually a sophisticated survival system, one where today's favor is tomorrow's insurance policy. Terry's family runs on a smaller, modernized version of exactly that system, minus the language to describe it as a system at all. He isn't just a soft touch. He's the current node in a network that's been passing resources hand to hand since before he was born, and stepping outside that role feels, to him, less like self-care and more like betrayal. Here's where the story bends, though, because none of that fully explains why Terry can't stop, even on the nights he clearly wants to. The obvious read on Terry is that he's simply generous, maybe to a fault, a good man who never learned where the line is. That read is comfortable, and it's incomplete. Go back to that 13-year-old boy watching his father go from essential to invisible in about 18 months. What Terry actually learned that year wasn't help people. What he learned was closer to. If you stop being useful, people stop calling, and if people stop calling, you disappear, even while you're still standing in the room. Overgiving, for a man built this way, isn't purely about the other person at all. It's a quiet, exhausting insurance policy against becoming his father, against the specific terror of being loved conditionally and finding out the condition has expired. That's the piece almost nobody around Terry can see, not Renee, not Denise, not Reggie, because it doesn't look like fear from the outside. It looks like strength. It looks like generosity. It looks like the most reliable man anyone knows. And it is all of those things, and it is also a man trying to outrun disappearing by making himself impossible to live without. The cost of running an insurance policy like that for 3 decades doesn't show up all at once. It shows up in installments. There's a particular sound Renee has learned to listen for on nights Terry doesn't know she's paying attention. A long exhale through his nose right before he picks up a call he doesn't actually want to take. She started keeping a mental list a few years back. Quietly, not out of resentment exactly, more out of the specific loneliness of loving someone who is present for everyone except, some weeks, for her. The anniversary dinner he left mid-appetizer because a customer's furnace died on the coldest night of February. The 2 Saturdays in a row he spent fixing his cousin's water heater instead of finishing the closet shelving he'd promised her for a year. None of these, on their own, would break a marriage. 29 years of them, stacked quietly on top of each other, can wear a couple down in a way neither person fully notices until a doctor is checking your husband's blood pressure twice in one appointment. Last November, on a Tuesday that started like any other, Terry sat eating a sandwich standing over the sink because sitting felt like wasting time, and instead felt his chest go tight and his left arm go numb for 11 seconds that Renee still remembers to the second. It turned out to be a stress episode, not a heart attack, the ER doctor was careful to say, though the tone made clear this had been a warning shot, not a false alarm. Terry spent that whole visit apologizing to the nurses for making a big deal out of nothing, while an IV was still taped to the back of his hand. That's not humility. That's a man so far outside the habit of being cared for that being cared for felt like an imposition. The hospital scare didn't stay contained to Terry and Renee, either. His son Jalen, 28 and living in Columbus, drove up the same night without being asked, something Terry noticed and didn't quite know what to do with. His daughter Aisha called every day for 2 weeks afterward, at first checking on her father, then, by the second week, gently pointing out that she couldn't remember the last time he'd asked either of them for help with anything ever, not once in 28 years. "That's kind of messed up, Dad," she told him, not unkindly, over the phone one evening. "Like, we don't even know how." Terry laughed it off in the moment, the same controlled laugh from the barbershop. But Aisha's sentence stayed with him, the way Marcus's had. Another small crack in a wall he'd spent decades reinforcing without ever really deciding to build it. 2 weeks after the hospital, Marcus called about the car again, a different problem this time, and Terry, out of pure reflex, started reaching for his keys. Renee didn't yell. She just said, quietly from the doorway, "You almost died standing at that sink, and the first thing your body wants to do is go fix somebody else's car. Terry stood there with his keys in his hand, and for maybe the first time in 40 years, actually heard himself from the outside. He didn't say anything profound back to her. He just put the keys down, called Marcus, and told him to call a tow truck like everybody else in America does at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Marcus was quiet on the phone for a second, then said, "You good, Uncle Terry?" in a tone that suggested he genuinely couldn't remember his uncle ever saying no to anything. That question sat with Terry longer than the chest pain had. Here's the part that took Terry the longest to accept, longer than accepting his own exhaustion, even longer than accepting the blood pressure diagnosis. His constant rescuing hadn't only been costing him, it had been quietly costing the people he rescued too. Marcus, at 26, had never once had to sit in a parking lot and solve his own car trouble, because Uncle Terry always solved it first. Family systems researchers, going back to the psychiatrist Murray Bowen, describe healthy relationships as requiring a certain amount of differentiation, enough separateness that each person still has to develop their own capacity to cope. When one person absorbs every hard moment for everyone else, nobody else gets the practice. Terry had spent 30 years being the family's shock absorber, and shock absorbers, by design, keep the rest of the car from feeling the road at all. That's not entirely a compliment. Sometimes the road is exactly what a 26-year-old needs to feel. It's worth saying plainly, none of this means Terry should have simply stopped caring, or hardened into a different kind of man overnight. The goal researchers in this space tend to point toward isn't the absence of generosity. It's what they sometimes call sustainable giving, help that flows from surplus rather than depletion, offered by choice on a given day rather than compelled by an old, unexamined fear. Terry didn't need less love in him. He needed somewhere to actually keep some of it for himself. There's a strength and cost pattern running underneath almost everything about Terry, and it's worth naming directly instead of leaving it implied. His hyper-reliability made him the most trusted HVAC tech in 3 zip codes, and it built a business that's outlasted 2 economic downturns on reputation alone. That same trait makes it almost physically uncomfortable for him to accept a favor, a compliment, or a day off without guilt trailing behind it. Strength and cost, welded to the same piece of steel, a fitting image for a man whose father spent 16 years actually welding steel for a living. The changes Terry made after that didn't look dramatic from the outside, which is usually how real change looks. He started letting calls from anyone other than Renee or his kids go to voicemail after 9 p.m., a rule that took him 3 tries to actually keep. He told Denise, gently, that he could no longer be the automatic answer to every financial gap, and that she should come to him with a plan instead of a number. He started invoicing the elderly customers he used to work for free, then quietly built a real, transparent line item into his own books for a handful of jobs he chooses to comp on purpose, instead of by exhausted accident. Denise noticed the shift before anyone else did, in a way only a sibling can. A few months into the new pattern, she called about a plumbing issue at her rental property, out of habit more than real need, and caught herself mid-sentence. "Wait," she said, half laughing, half serious. "I don't even know why I called you instead of an actual plumber." Terry laughed too, but this time it wasn't the controlled barbershop laugh. It was something closer to relief, the specific relief of watching an old pattern loosen its grip on someone else, not just on him. At the barbershop, when Reggie made another joke about the family bank, Terry said, evenly, "Banks closed on Sundays now," and let the silence sit there instead of laughing it off. Reggie blinked, then actually nodded, the way men do when they respect a boundary more than they expected to. None of this made Terry a different person. He still shows up for the people he loves, he just no longer confuses showing up with disappearing. 6 months later it's 2:14 in the morning again, and Terry's phone lights up on the nightstand. Renee doesn't reach over to nudge him this time. She just watches him check the screen, see that it's Marcus asking if a gas station is open near the highway, not stranded, just curious, and set the phone face down without a second thought. "You're not going?" she asks, half awake, mostly teasing. "Nah," Terry says. "He's got it." There's no ceremony in that sentence, no big speech about boundaries or healing, just a 55-year-old man rolling back over and going to sleep in his own bed for once. That's what stopping actually looks like for men built the way Terry was built. Not a dramatic wall going up, just a slow, ordinary decision, repeated on enough Tuesdays, that his own exhaustion finally counts as data too. His father, Otis, never got the chance to learn that lesson. The mill closed before anyone taught it to him, and nobody in his generation was handing out that kind of permission. Terry is the first man in his family to hand it to himself. These days, when Terry stands in his own garage on a quiet Sunday, he sometimes thinks about his father in that same kind of space, 40 years earlier, surrounded by a radio and a car he never finished. Terry finished his own project last spring, a go-kart he rebuilt with Jalen over 3 unhurried weekends, using, appropriately enough, a good number of screws from that same stubborn coffee can. Some inheritances you don't get to choose. This one, it turns out, he's slowly learning to edit. That's not selfishness. That's just a man finally putting his own name in the ledger after 30 years of writing everybody else's. If any part of this sounded like somebody you know, or somebody you see in the mirror, there's a video linked above about what happens when that same quiet exhaustion goes unspoken for another 20 years, and what it actually takes to interrupt it sooner.